So, as Chris mentioned, I was a Paul Miller Fellow back in the dark ages of the 1990s. And I'll tell you, it's an invaluable experience. I hope that you guys have had a good time with it. And I was a regional reporter at the time. I was writing for newspapers out west. And I think that's a great way, and I know there's a number of regionals here too. It's sort of a great way to get into the Washington beat, because you can own your community. You can cover the snot out of the Texas delegation. And you ought to. And all the people around them. And the other thing is that you never know who may end up in some place big. You know, one of my colleagues, Maureen Groppe, has covered Indiana for years. She covered Mike Pence as a congressman. You never know when that person may become governor, or governor and vice president and potentially president one day. And so you know all the players around these political figures. And so I would encourage you, I mean, one of the things that I did as a regional is, just by virtue of covering the delegation, you can make sort of campaign finance, watchdog reporting sort of a subspecialty. I mean, I spent hours back in the dark ages going through travel records that members of Congress had to file on paper, indicating how much they were, how many trips they were taking at the expense of lobbyists and their staffs. Unfortunately, you still have to do it at the Senate. I'll come back to that in a second. But I want to make the case that maybe you really should take campaign finance and this watchdog reporting, make it sort of one of your specialties. I mean, it's interesting. It gets to the issues at the heart of our democracy. Who has power? How, who's pulling the strings on the delegations that you cover? And the other thing is, you never get bored. I mean, Michael mentioned at the outset how much things have changed since the Citizens United decision in 2010. I mean, I remember when super PACs were a brand new thing, we all do, and then it became candidates had to have their own pet, super PACs that were tied to them. Now we're in an era in the last election cycle where donors think they know best and are forming their own super PACs and are becoming political strategists. And they will tell you, well, I have a lot of money. I know how to do things. And so, and these folks are, they're making key decisions about who they think ought to be president of the United States. So I would say that you'll never get bored chasing these stories. So I have a couple themes I want to touch on. One is to know your people. You obviously will know your delegations well, you'll know your candidates, but you need to know who are the people around them. I mean, who's the campaign treasurer? Who are their closest allies? Who are the biggest donors in your community? Traditionally, and in this cycle, sort of who's been giving a lot. I mean, sometimes it's well worth your while to go back to a previous election cycle. Look at who supported Ted Cruz in his presidential race. Look at who supported Ted Cruz. I'm looking at folks who cover Texas here. I apologize. Who covered them in the previous cycle? Who supported them? Who have these donors supported in the past? If you're in Houston, for example, Steve Mostyn is a big Democratic donor. He's someone that you should know really well. He's a trial lawyer in Houston. He and his wife, and they're more than donors. They're activists and strategists, and they very much see themselves as helping turn the state of Texas blue, saying that the changing demographics mean that Texas will be Democratic one day. And they also play a big role in whoever is, seeking the presidency. I mean, that's one of the things that I have learned covering this beat. There are certain people nationally and in states through whom every candidate runs. Every person who wants to be a senator from Texas has to know a class of donors. Every person who wants to be president has to know a class of donors. Anyone who wants to be a governor of a state knows a guy named Fred Malek, for instance, who is the top fundraiser for the Republican Governors Association and has been involved in campaigns for years. And if you're covering these communities or you're covering particular candidates, you need to know them too. I need to be chasing your stories, like you're the experts in what's happening in your communities. One of the things to also look for, as Michael mentioned, you want to sort of have a sense of who the big donors are. One of the reasons you want to know historically what the patterns are in your communities is that you want to know who's missing. I mean, that was one of the stories of this last election cycle. The utter revulsion that Republican donors felt for the people who were leading in the polls in their primaries. They all went in for Jeb, and he just flamed out immediately. And they sat on the sidelines forever. And those were good stories because you were able to go back and say, these were the players before, and they're not going with Ted. And they're certainly not going with Trump. And how is Trump managing to do this without these players? The other thing I would say is picking a theme. Like, we all have a ton of stuff to cover. And particularly if you're more of a generalist, and I don't know, how many people here are sort of like just, like you cover everything and other folks more specialized? Okay. Is campaign finance something that you consider a specialty? No, not at this point. Because, I mean, what I would say is when you have a lot of things to cover, you might say for the course of an election cycle, here are the one or two themes of this campaign that I want to own. I mean, obviously in the 2010 election cycle, the Citizens United decision came out in January. And so I wanted, for 2010, I wanted to understand how did super PACs affect this election cycle. In the 2016 cycle, frankly long before, I said to myself, well, I want to understand more about Charles Koch, right? I mean, these people are rivaling the Republican Party in terms of spending and influence. And so I got the first interview with Charles Koch, I think, so that's, what date is that? In April 2015. I mean, we all have been chasing interviews with him. But I spent probably a year between everything else, getting to know the people in his organization, the people around him who had influence, introducing myself, cups of coffee, staff would change, get to know the new people, both in the political organization, but one of the things I came to realize is that it was also important to get to know people in the corporate structure. I mean, this is a guy who runs the second largest private company in the United States. He is one of the wealthiest men on the planet. And so trying to sort of work my way around, writing stories all the while, but always in the back of my mind, how do I get to him? And so this story was, this is my first sit down with him, and we were talking about him and the company and why he decided to sort of get involved in politics and why he's even deciding to talk to me. And we got a great scoop. I mean, a lot of people knew that Charles Koch liked 5 candidates in the primaries. You know, because I sat at his desk and asked him the question, I think about 8 times until we got to that point. And so what I said, it was like a little project. I mean, I almost felt like I was doing a semester of work on Charles Koch. I read everything that he had written. I read about people that he admired. I read most articles about him. And it just became, it was one of my themes headed into 2016. Who is this guy? And can we talk to him? And I was just intensely curious about him as well. I mean, he's interesting. Why would you decide to get involved in politics in this level? And so it's the same thing in 2012, and I don't think we have the story because there's a problem with the link, but I decided, Mitt Romney, for instance, said that he became the first presidential nominee in recent years to say, I am not going to tell you who's raising money on my behalf. I'm not going to give you the names of my bundlers. These are the folks who, go and ask friends and associates and relatives to give the donations at $2,700 each, and sort of bundle together the money that it needs to run a campaign. And Mitt Romney was very much taking that approach. And I remember I was like, on Monday morning I woke up and I said, I'm going to find out who they are. And together with a colleague, we sat down and we looked at every invitation that we could find for events. The Sunlight Foundation had been a very good source of that. There's a site called Political Party Time, and they sort of get in invitations. We looked at every news article that said so-and-so was at a fundraiser. and this happened to this one's house. We looked at every news release, and we built our own spreadsheet of something like 3,000 names. And then we researched them to see, well, what were their occupations, and then we coded them by industry. I mean, this was not available. And sometimes you just have to build it from scratch. And so, again, having a plan and saying, okay, this is one of the things that I want to do in this election. I'm going to tell people, he's decided he's not going to release the names of his bundlers. I'm going to look at those bundlers, and doing the hard thing and building it on your own. Sometimes you still have to do that. And that is still in use. In the last election cycle, the New York Times did a piece in which they compared the bundlers in this cycle to the Romney bundlers, and they only had the list of the Romney bundlers because we built it. We're the only people who did it. And sometimes it's worth it to say, sometimes if it's hard, you want to do it because it means your competitors have hit the same roadblock and said, it would take me 3 weeks to do that. Well, so what? I mean, what else are you doing? I mean, you have stories to do, but they're evenings, they're weekends, this is how you set yourself apart. The other thing is, I would say, in addition to knowing the people around the people you cover, is to really know your records. I think that tip sheet is a good start. You also need to know the people who are the enemies of your people, if you will. I mean, there are lots. One of the things that's happened, I think, in the last 5 to 6 years is the rise of opposition research. Here in Washington, I guess there are two main big groups. I mean, all the parties have always done their opposition research, but sort of Republicans are using American Rising, which is a more for-profit organization. Democrats are using something called American Bridge 21st Century, and they've become like these major centers of opposition research. There is someone, if you are covering a candidate who is running for office, there is someone sitting over on Massachusetts Avenue in this loft-like space with enormous servers who knows everything about your candidate. If your candidate is a Republican, same thing is happening on the Republican side. It would be very useful for you to know who that person is and what he or she knows about your candidate. Now, I'm not saying that you have to sort of swallow every bit of opposition research that comes your way, but it really does matter that you know who they are and they know who you are, because there may be a tip that you get because you've just built up, who are the people around the candidate that you're covering. You know their donors, you know their friends, you know their enemies. One other thing about records too, it's good to know what's available, and it's also good to know how difficult some records still are to get. For instance, if you are a Senate candidate or a senator, you can still opt to file your paperwork on paper. That is, you have a campaign finance system that is entirely electronic. You put in all the information, then you print it out and mail it to the Senate. And then at the Senate, they take it in, they clean it up a little bit, they make a PDF of it, they put it up on a computer in the Senate offices. Then they send it to the FEC, and the FEC pays someone to retype something that started off as an electronic document to make it electronic again. It really takes about 2 weeks for that stuff to show up electronically. But if you're covering a candidate, and when I was a regional reporter, or if there's someone still now that I'm very interested in this intense race, I go up to the Senate. It's the Senate Hart Building, room 232. And and you go there and you show up and you say, is the file available? Because I'm telling you, those opposition researchers are sitting up there too. They're the ones their opponents are poached waiting. And you can start to find out stuff even if they won't tell you. I'm not a big fan of like the process stories necessarily, but if you're covering a delegation and all of them are filing on paper, or one of them has decided not to file on paper, and I guess you only have 2 senators, but you can contrast that. You can ask them questions about, why did you decide to file this on paper? And ask them if it's a matter of trying to slow the process down. Donald Trump's inaugural committee, which raised nearly $107 million, a record amount, twice what President Obama's inaugural committee raised, decided to file their report on paper. There were some interesting collaborations that happened among journalists to try to quickly get that information on electronic form to sort of tell some stories with it. But I think it's, it's a great story to ask people, why are you still filing on paper? Why did you file? In some cases, to slow the system down, you may have a senator who you only have to report donations of $200 or more. Some of them report every single donation to make the paper file really, really big. They could say that it's a matter of disclosure, that they're trying to be full. But why not, if they care so much about disclosure, do they not just file it electronically? The other thing that I would say, and we were talking a little bit here with Katie about sort of source development and chatting with people and going out. I mean, a lot of the people that we cover, the billionaires and millionaires, we are not going to run into them at any cocktail party that a journalist is at. It's just not going to happen. And keep in mind, they don't have to talk to you. I mean, you obviously can build a great story looking at the data. I think one of the ways that you could decide to set yourself apart as a Washington reporter is by being nice, by being polite. One of my little tricks is something my mother taught me. I write handwritten notes to people after I meet them or after they've given me an interview on my personal stationery with my note with my business card attached. Think of ways that you can stand out. I mean, one is just by being a hustler, really hardworking, doing the stuff quickly. But you really do have to persuade people to give you the story as opposed to someone else. And think of that. Anyway, I'm done for now.